The beat-up sedan slowed at the intersection, its engine sputtering a little. Inside, a young girl, probably no older than 8 or 9, sat rigidly in the passenger seat. Her eyes, wide and a little glassy, darted around, then landed on a man standing on the corner, casually leaning against a lamppost. Without a sound, without moving her head, her small hand rose to the window, palm out. Her thumb tucked into her palm, and then her fingers closed over it, trapping it. It was the signal, the universal hand signal for help, for domestic violence. It was quick, almost invisible. But the man in the car, the driver, saw it. He didn't say anything, but his left hand, heavy and dismissive, waved vaguely in her direction. A silent scoff. It was a gesture that said, "I saw that, and it means nothing." The man leaning against the lamppost wasn't just any man. Jake had seen a lot in his life, things that most people only saw in movies. He wasn't a SEAL anymore. Not officially, but some things never left you. The way you noticed details, the way you read people, the way you understood unspoken calls for help. He saw the girl's signal. He saw the driver's dismissive wave. His jaw tightened, but outwardly, he remained completely still, his face giving nothing away. He just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was so small, so quick, that if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. But the girl, her eyes still on him, caught it. A flicker of something. Maybe hope, maybe just recognition, passed through her eyes. The sedan lurched forward, making the turn down Elm Street. Jake pushed off the lamppost, falling into a casual, unhurried pace. His mind, however, was anything but unhurried. He knew that signal. He knew what it meant. And he knew that the man driving had just tried to shut it down. A cold certainty settled in his gut. No child should ever have to ask twice. The words played in his head like a mantra. He kept his stride even, blending in with the late afternoon foot traffic. He wasn't running, not yet, but every muscle in his body was coiled, ready. He watched the red taillights of the sedan disappear around another corner, heading deeper into the residential area. For a second, it was out of sight. That brief moment of losing his target sent a jolt through him. He sped up, his casual walk turning into a determined stride. The urgency was building, a fire starting deep inside him. He knew he had to catch up, had to see where they were going. He had to know. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Jake wasn't just some random guy. He was Jake Miller, a name that used to mean something in certain circles, but now just meant a guy who lived in a quiet suburban town in the United States. This town, Willow Creek, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. It had tree-lined streets, a decent coffee shop, and a community park where kids played until dusk. Life here moved at a slower pace, a stark contrast to the high-stakes world Jake had left behind. After his years as a Navy SEAL, Jake had sought out this kind of peace. He'd seen enough chaos, enough of the worst of humanity, to last several lifetimes. He wanted quiet, maybe a future with a family, a normal life. But some parts of him, the parts that were always on alert, never truly shut down. His military service had etched itself deep into him, leaving behind a quiet intensity. He had a deep-seated need to protect, especially the innocent. It was a need born partly from his training, but also from a mission years ago that had gone sideways, resulting in civilian casualties he couldn't prevent. That memory still haunted him, a silent vow to never let something like that happen on his watch again, if he could help it. He often dreamed of a simple life, a house with a garden, and the laughter of children he could keep safe. But the world, as he knew, rarely offered simple. The man driving the sedan, the one who had waved off the girl's signal, his name was Mark. Jake knew him. Not well, but enough. Mark was a new resident, having moved to Willow Creek a few months back. He'd introduced himself at a community BBQ, all charm and easy smiles. He was charismatic, the kind of guy who could talk his way into any social circle. He quickly became a fixture, always offering to help, always with a story. But there was something about Mark that always felt a little off to Jake. A subtle, unsettling quality that Jake, with his honed instincts, couldn't quite place. Mark was often seen with the young girl, Lily. He introduced her as his niece, explaining that her parents were traveling overseas for work, and he was her guardian. Over the past few weeks, Jake had seen them around. Small things, almost too small to register to anyone else, had caught his attention. He remembered seeing Mark pull Lily's arm a little too roughly when she lagged behind in the grocery store. Another time, he'd overheard Mark speaking sharply to her, a harsh word disguised as a joke. But the sting in Lily's eyes was clear. Lily herself seemed withdrawn, quiet, always a few steps behind Mark, her gaze often fixed on her shoes. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it seemed forced, a reflex rather than genuine joy. These observations, combined with Jake's own past, created a simmering unease within him. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself he was being overly sensitive, projecting his own past traumas onto an innocent situation. But the gut feeling persisted. He'd seen enough scared children in his life to recognize the signs, however faint. He'd noticed how Mark always seemed to control the conversation when Lily was around, how he'd answer for her before she even had a chance to speak. It was these little details, these quiet moments of control and fear, that had made Jake so incredibly attuned to Lily's desperate signal. It wasn't just a random act he witnessed. It was the culmination of weeks of subtle, growing concern. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that something was very wrong. The unease Jake felt had been a slow build, a collection of small moments that, when put together, started to paint a disturbing picture. It wasn't one big thing, but 1,000 little cracks in Mark's carefully constructed image. Jake remembered a town fair where Mark had promised Lily a giant stuffed animal if she behaved perfectly. Lily had tried so hard, her small face set in a determined frown. But when it came time to leave, Mark just laughed, saying they didn't have room in the car. Lily's shoulders had slumped, and she'd walked away without a word, her eyes downcast. Mark hadn't even seemed to notice, too busy chatting up a neighbor. There were other times. Jake recalled seeing Mark suddenly reach out and grab Lily's arm, not with anger, but with a surprising quickness that made the girl flinch. Mark would then act like nothing happened, maybe even pat her head, but the way Lily tensed up, pulling her arm away slowly, spoke volumes. It was a subtle dance of control and fear that only someone looking for it would see. Mark also had a way of belittling Lily that he disguised as playful teasing. He'd make fun of her drawings, saying they looked like chicken scratch, or dismiss her ideas about what game to play as silly girl stuff. He'd always end it with a chuckle, making it seem harmless. But Jake often caught the way Lily's initial enthusiasm would drain from her face, replaced by a quiet resignation. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a pattern, slowly eroding any comfort or trust Lily might have felt, and certainly any Jake might have had in Mark. Jake also noticed how Mark used his charm to manipulate others, painting himself as the devoted guardian. He'd talk about the sacrifices he was making for Lily, how she was all he had left of his sister, pulling on people's heartstrings. He'd volunteer for town events, always with Lily in tow, making sure everyone saw him as a caring, responsible figure. But Jake saw through it. He saw how Mark subtly isolated Lily from other children. If Lily tried to join a game, Mark would quickly interject, saying, "Oh, Lily's a bit shy today," or "She needs some quiet time." He'd make excuses for her not attending playdates, claiming she had special lessons or wasn't feeling well, effectively preventing her from forming bonds with her peers. It was a clever way to keep her dependent on him, to ensure she had no outside support system. The most chilling memory for Jake was a conversation he'd overheard at the local coffee shop. Mark was talking to Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman who often brought cookies to Lily. Mark was complaining, with a sigh, about how difficult Lily could be, how she misunderstood things, and how he was doing his best. He made it sound like Lily was the problem, a burden he was nobly carrying. Mrs. Henderson, clearly sympathetic, had nodded along, offering words of encouragement. Jake, sitting a few tables away, felt a cold knot in his stomach. He saw the manipulation, the way Mark twisted the narrative to make himself seem like the victim, and Lily, the difficult child. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, and it made Jake's skin crawl. These prior events, these small, insidious acts, were why Lily's signal hit Jake so hard. It wasn't just a random, distressed child he saw. It was Lily, the quiet girl whose spirit he'd watched dim over weeks. Her signal wasn't a sudden, isolated cry for help. It was the culmination of prolonged emotional distress, of perceived injustice, of a child slowly being crushed under the weight of an adult's insidious control. It validated every single one of Jake's simmering concerns, every gut feeling he'd tried to ignore. It confirmed what he had suspected all along. Something was profoundly wrong, and Lily was trapped. The signal was her last, desperate attempt to break free, and Jake, with his past and his instincts, was perfectly positioned to finally see it for what it was. The emotional atmosphere around Mark and Lily only got worse. Jake noticed how Mark's behavior seemed to fray at the edges, becoming less careful. He started to hear hushed arguments coming from Mark's house more often, even from his own backyard. Sometimes he'd see Lily looking out her window, her face stained with tears, her eyes red-rimmed. These weren't quiet disagreements. They were sharp, cutting words, even if Jake couldn't always make out exactly what was being said. Lily's usually withdrawn demeanor became even more pronounced, almost as if she was trying to disappear. Mark's carefully constructed public persona, which had fooled so many, also started to crack. Jake saw it in small, telling moments. Once, at the local hardware store, Mark got into a sharp exchange with a cashier over a minor pricing error. His voice, usually smooth and charming, became harsh and aggressive, laced with an edge of entitlement that was truly unsettling. The cashier, a young woman, looked visibly shaken. Another time, at the town's weekly farmers market, Mark snapped at a vendor when a vegetable wasn't exactly what he wanted. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. These were quick glimpses, fleeting moments that most people might dismiss as someone having a bad day. But to Jake, they were proof that the mask was slipping. Community members, who had initially been so charmed by Mark, started to express subtle concerns. Mrs. Henderson, the kindly elderly woman, once mentioned to Jake, "Mark seems a little stressed lately, doesn't he? And poor Lily, she looks so pale." Another neighbor, a father of two, casually remarked, I offered for Lily to come over and play with my kids, but Mark always has an excuse. Says she's not feeling up to it. It's a shame. These weren't accusations, just quiet observations, but they showed that Mark's polished act was losing its shine. Yet despite these growing murmurs, no one acted decisively. No one wanted to be the one to rock the boat, to accuse someone who, on the surface, seemed like a decent, if somewhat intense guardian. Mark, in turn, became more defensive. Any questions about Lily's well-being, however gentle, were met with practiced excuses, delivered with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, Lily's just going through a phase," he'd say, or "teenagers, right? So moody." He'd dismiss any concerns about her pallor or quietness as typical adolescent behavior, effectively shutting down any further inquiry. This defensiveness only served to further isolate Lily, creating an invisible wall around her that deterred even the most well-meaning neighbors from getting too close. It was a suffocating environment, both for Lily and for anyone who cared enough to notice. Jake felt the heavy weight of judgment building, not from others, but from himself. He saw the silent pleas in Lily's eyes, the way she would subtly shrink away from Mark's touch, the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden. He grappled with the ethical dilemma of intervention versus observation. His training as a SEAL had taught him to assess, to plan, to execute. But civilian life was different. There were rules, protocols, and the fear of overstepping. He felt immense pressure, a crushing sense of responsibility, knowing he was probably the only one truly seeing the situation for what it was. He was the only one connecting the dots, seeing the patterns, and understanding the silent language of distress. This internal struggle, this constant battle between his instinct to protect and the societal norms of non-interference, pushed him to a point of near emotional breaking. He knew he couldn't just stand by much longer. The hand signal, then, wasn't just a plea. It was a breaking point for Jake. It shattered the status quo, pushing him past the ethical dilemmas and the societal pressures that had held him back. He couldn't observe anymore. He had to act. His first move was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else. He started monitoring Mark's activities, not with overt surveillance, but with the quiet, practiced awareness of a trained operative. He noticed patterns: Mark's inconsistent work schedule, the late-night visitors who never stayed long, the way Mark seemed to avoid certain parts of town. Jake used his investigative skills, honed from years of gathering intelligence. He didn't hack into databases or break laws, but he used public information and keen observation. He checked online records, looking for anything that might explain Mark's behavior or his past. What he found was a series of small, seemingly unrelated incidents that, when pieced together, painted a clear picture. Mark had a history of minor financial fraud in a neighboring state. Nothing that led to jail time, but enough to show a pattern of deceit. There were also 2 restraining orders from previous relationships, both citing emotional manipulation and threats. These weren't violent crimes, but they revealed a personality prone to control and intimidation, especially towards vulnerable individuals. This wasn't just about Lily. It was about Mark's character. The biggest revelation came from an old newspaper clipping Jake found online. Mark had been the guardian of another young girl years ago, an orphan, who had inherited a small sum of money. The girl had vanished from public records shortly after turning 18, and the inheritance had also disappeared. The local police had investigated, but found nothing conclusive, ruling it a runaway case. For Jake, this was the missing piece. Mark wasn't just an abusive guardian, he was a predator. likely after Lily's future inheritance or any assets she might have. The charm, the isolation, the subtle belittling, it was all part of a calculated plan. Armed with this information, Jake knew he couldn't confront Mark directly. Mark was too manipulative, too good at deflecting. A direct confrontation would only put Lily in more danger. Jake decided to report his findings to the authorities, but he knew he needed more than just old newspaper clippings. He needed something current, something undeniable. He decided to create a situation that would force Mark to reveal his true self in public. Jake contacted social services, anonymously at first, mentioning concerns about Lily's well-being and Mark's past financial irregularities. He didn't make accusations, just provided enough information to trigger an official inquiry. He knew this would make Mark nervous, put him on edge. Then he waited. The social worker's visit came 2 days later. Jake watched from his window as the social worker, a stern-looking woman, knocked on Mark's door. Mark, initially charming, quickly grew agitated when the conversation moved beyond pleasantries. Jake saw his body language change, his smile tightening, his gestures becoming more abrupt. The social worker left after about 20 minutes. Later that evening, Jake saw Mark packing bags into his car. Not just his own, but Lily's small backpack too. This was it. Mark was making a desperate, egregious mistake. He was attempting to flee with Lily, confirming Jake's suspicions. Mark, cornered and exposed, was reacting violently. Not physically, but with a desperate act of abduction. His true nature, that of a man willing to disappear with a child to protect his own selfish interests, was now undeniable. This moment broke the cycle of suffering. The story shifted from observation to active intervention. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, his heart pounding, and called the police, providing them with Mark's car description and direction of travel. He was no longer just a spectator. He was an actor in Lily's rescue. The long, agonizing wait was finally over. The phone call to the police felt like it lasted an eternity, though it was only minutes. Jake gave them every detail he had. Mark's car, the direction he was heading, Lily's description, and his own suspicions about Mark's past. He watched the taillights of Mark's car disappear down the street, feeling a mix of relief that he had finally acted, and profound distress for Lily. The image of her small backpack being tossed into the car haunted him. He knew he had done the right thing. But the fear for her safety was a heavy weight in his chest. He paced his living room, the silence of his house amplified by the frantic thoughts racing through his mind. He grappled with the emotional aftermath of his intervention. What if the police didn't get there in time? What if Mark hurt Lily out of desperation? The what-ifs were endless, each one a fresh wave of anxiety. He remembered the feeling from his time in the field, the gut-wrenching suspense after making a critical decision, waiting for the outcome. This felt different, though. This was personal. This was a little girl he had watched, quietly worried about, and now actively tried to save. Soon, the quiet of the neighborhood was broken by the wail of sirens. Police cars, followed by an ambulance, sped down the street, turning in the direction Mark had taken. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline, hope mixing with terror. He knew this was it. The community, usually so calm, was now stirring. Lights flickered on in houses up and down the street. Neighbors peered out their windows, some stepping onto their porches, wondering what the commotion was about. A few minutes later, Mrs. Henderson from next door, a kind elderly woman who often gardened, walked over to Jake's yard. "Jake, what in heaven's name is going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake explained, quickly and concisely, what he had witnessed and what he suspected. Mrs. Henderson's face, initially filled with curiosity, paled as he spoke. "Oh, that poor child," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I always thought there was something off about that man. He was so charming, but I saw Lily once. She looked so sad." Other neighbors started to gather, drawn by the sirens and Mrs. Henderson's distress. Mr. Davies, a retired teacher, joined them. He had often waved to Mark and Lily. Too, "Mark seemed like such a good guy," he said, shaking his head. "Always smiling. I can't believe it." The initial cultural emphasis on privacy, the American tendency to mind one's own business, had initially kept many from questioning Mark too deeply. But now, with the truth undeniable and unfolding before their eyes, the community's underlying sense of justice was mobilizing support. They looked at Jake with a mix of shock, admiration, and regret. Regret that they hadn't seen it, hadn't acted. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't looking for praise, but the sudden outpouring of concern for Lily, the shared outrage, was a comfort. It showed that even if people were slow to see it, their hearts were in the right place. The police returned about an hour later, lights still flashing but moving slowly. An officer approached Jake, his expression serious. "We apprehended Mr. Williams about 10 miles out. Lily is safe. She's with the paramedics now, being checked over. She's a little shaken, but physically unharmed." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "Thank God," he murmured. The officer continued. "And Mr. Williams, he's in custody. We found some interesting things in his car and on his person. Looks like you were right about him trying to disappear. Thank you, sir. Your quick thinking saved that little girl." Lily was deeply affected, as expected. Paramedics described her as withdrawn, clinging to a blanket, but with a glimmer of hope in her eyes when they told her she was safe. The initial chaos of the pursuit and rescue was giving way to a fragile sense of safety. Jake, too, felt the weight of his past and the present, the echoes of his military service, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He had protected an innocent life, and that feeling was profound. The night was far from over, but the immediate danger had passed. In the days that followed, the town slowly began to process the events. Lily, after being medically cleared, was placed in the care of Child Protective Services. It was a difficult transition, but Jake made sure to stay connected, visiting her at the temporary shelter. He learned that her parents had passed away 2 years prior, and Mark, a distant relative, had stepped in, presenting himself as a benevolent guardian. The truth, as revealed by police investigation and Mark's own twisted confessions, was that he had been systematically isolating Lily to gain control of a small inheritance left to her by her parents. He never expected anyone to notice. Lily's journey of healing was long and gradual. At first, she was very quiet, her eyes still holding that distant, guarded look. But with consistent support from therapists and the kind-hearted staff at the shelter, small changes began to appear. She started drawing again, filling pages with colorful, if sometimes somber pictures. Her laughter, once almost forgotten, began to echo in the halls. One day, during a visit, she showed Jake a drawing of a small girl holding hands with a strong, shadowy figure, a tiny hand signal clearly visible on the girl's palm. Jake understood. He knew she was starting to trust again. Mark faced the full force of the law. The evidence Jake had gathered, combined with the detailed police investigation, his history of similar manipulative behaviors in other towns, and eventually, Lily's brave testimony painted a clear picture. He was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and fraud. The trial was swift, and the verdict was guilty on all counts. Mark was sentenced to a long prison term, ensuring he would not be able to harm any other child. Justice, in this case, was served publicly and unequivocally, and for Jake, the resolution brought a profound sense of peace. He had spent years carrying the weight of past failures from his military days, the feeling that he hadn't always been able to protect those who needed it most. Saving Lily was a redemption, a tangible proof that he could still make a difference. He didn't seek recognition, but the quiet gratitude from Lily's new foster family, a loving couple who lived a few towns over, meant the world to him. They kept him updated on Lily's progress, sending him photos of her smiling, playing, and simply being a child. Jake found a new purpose. He started volunteering at a local organization that helped at-risk children, channeling his protective instincts into advocacy. He shared his story, not for glory, but to raise awareness about the silent signals of distress that children might give. He emphasized the importance of vigilance, of looking beyond the surface, and of having the courage to act when something felt wrong. He often spoke about how easy it was to dismiss subtle signs, how the desire not to interfere could sometimes leave innocent people vulnerable. The community, once hesitant, now rallied around the cause. Mrs. Henderson became a fierce advocate, organizing neighborhood watch meetings and sharing information on recognizing signs of abuse. Mr. Davies started a mentorship program for children, ensuring they had trusted adults they could talk to. The incident with Mark and Lily had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder that evil could hide behind a charming smile, but also that everyday heroes walked among them. Lily, years later, grew into a bright, resilient young woman. She never forgot the man who saw her signal, the man who saved her. She went on to study law, determined to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. Jake, now older, would sometimes receive letters from her, updates on her life, always signed with a small, discreet drawing of a hand signal. It was a reminder of their shared past, a testament to the power of a single act of courage. His life was no longer defined by the shadows of war, but by the light of a child he had helped save, proving that even the quietest plea, when heard by the right person, could change everything. The story of Lily and Jake became a quiet legend in their town, a powerful lesson that some signals should never be ignored.